The winter of 1887 came down on the Dakota Territory like a hammer. It was not a gentle season that eased its way into the landscape, but a sudden, violent arrival that seemed to carry a personal malice. The sky, once a vast and hopeful blue, turned to a slab of cold iron, pressing down on the endless plains. The wind was born in the Arctic, and it traveled south with nothing to stop it, nothing to slow it, nothing to break its momentum. It scoured the prairie, stripping the last of the autumn warmth from the soil and freezing the ground into a solid, unyielding block. For the settlers in the small, unnamed cluster of cabins that clung to the banks of a frozen creek, this was not just weather, it was a siege. The cold did not knock before it entered. It seeped through the chinking between the logs of their hastily built homes, a silent, invisible thief that stole the heat from their fires and the strength from their bodies. It coated the inside of their window panes with intricate, cruel ferns of frost. It made the floorboards groan and the very timbers of the cabins contract with a sound like a pained sigh. To live through it was a constant battle, a war waged with axes and saws against the dwindling woodpiles, and with blankets and prayers against the drafts that moved through the rooms like phantom knives. Ilara had known this cold before. She had felt its touch on her skin and heard its howl in the long nights. Her husband, Martin, had been taken by a fever that the relentless chill had nursed into a fatal pneumonia 2 winters prior. Now a widow with 2 small children, Thomas, who was 7, and Lily, who was 5, she faced the coming siege with a fear that was colder than the wind itself. Her cabin was no different from the others, a standard box of rough-hewn logs, built according to the wisdom of the community. It was a design that prized speed and familiarity over function, a design that had proven itself, year after year, to be a miserable failure against the true Dakota winter. In the evenings, she would watch her children, their faces pale in the flickering firelight, their breath misting in the air of their own home. She would pile the blankets on their small beds, but she knew it was a losing fight. The fire demanded a constant tribute of wood, devouring logs with a ravenous hunger. The heat it produced was a fleeting thing, a small circle of comfort in a room dominated by the encroaching cold. Step too far from the hearth, and the chill would wrap around you instantly. She spent her days chopping wood until her hands were raw and her back screamed, and her nights feeding the stove, knowing that every log she burned was one less she had for the long months ahead. The woodpile, which had seemed so large in the autumn, was shrinking at an alarming rate. The struggle was not hers alone. It was the shared condition of the entire settlement. In the evenings, the smoke from 24 chimneys rose into the frigid air, thin gray columns of defiance against the overwhelming power of the season. But inside those homes, the story was the same. Families huddled together, shivering. The old folks coughed, a dry, rasping sound that spoke of irritated lungs. Babies cried with a persistent, weary fretfulness. The men, their faces chapped and grim, spoke of the dwindling wood supply and the ferocity of the wind. They did what they had always done. They stuffed more rags into the gaps in the walls, they nailed more boards over the windows, and they cut more wood. It was a cycle of desperate, repetitive labor that yielded only temporary, inadequate relief. They were fighting the winter with brute force, and they were losing. The acknowledged leader in all matters of construction was a man named Jedediah. He was broad-shouldered and confident, a man whose hands were calloused from a lifetime of swinging an axe and a hammer. He had built nearly every cabin in the settlement, and he built them all the same way. Thick logs, notched tight, with a steep-pitched roof to shed the snow. It was the way his father had taught him, and the way everyone else did it. To suggest another way was to suggest that Jedediah, and by extension, the entire community's accumulated wisdom, was wrong. No one did. But Alara had a memory, and she had a secret. Martin had not been a farmer or a carpenter by trade. In the old country, in Germany, he had been an engineer, a man who thought in terms of principles, of thermodynamics and geology. He had brought with him a small crate of books, filled with diagrams and theories that the other settlers would have found incomprehensible and useless. After his death, in the depths of her grief, Alara had kept the books, though she could not read the dense German text. But she remembered the nights Martin had sat by the fire, sketching in a notebook and explaining his ideas to her. He had been fascinated by the old ways, by the ancient European farmsteads built into the earth itself. One evening, as the wind rattled the door in its frame, and the last of her day's wood was turning to embers, she pulled out his old notebook. She could not read his words, but she understood the drawings. There were sketches of houses nestled into hillsides, their backs and sides protected by the immense, stable mass of the earth. He had drawn arrows showing the flow of air, the winter wind shearing harmlessly over a low, sod-covered roof, and the low winter sun beaming through south-facing windows. He had written notes in the margins, and she remembered him speaking the words, his voice filled with a quiet excitement. "The earth is a blanket," he had said. "In the summer it is cool. In the winter it holds a deep, slow warmth. Why fight the cold when you can ask the earth to shelter you from it?" An idea, born of desperation and memory, began to form in her mind. It was a terrifying, radical thought. The community was planning to expand in the spring, to build new cabins on the open flatland west of the creek. She owned a small plot of land that included a low, south-facing hill. The other settlers considered it poor land for building, uneven and difficult. To Martin, it had been the perfect spot. The idea was simple in its concept, yet monumental in its departure from tradition. She would not build a house on the land. She would build it in the land. She would dig into the face of that hill and use the earth itself as 3 of her walls. The decision did not come easily. It meant defying the collective knowledge of her neighbors, the very people on whom her survival depended. It meant undertaking a project of immense labor alone. But then she looked at Thomas, his small body curled up against the cold, and at Lily, whose cough had begun to echo the dry, worrying sound she heard from the other cabins. The memory of Martin's final, shivering days was a fresh wound. The fear of what would happen if she did nothing was greater than the fear of what might happen if she tried something different. The current way was a proven path to suffering, and perhaps to death. A new path, however uncertain, offered a sliver of hope. When spring finally broke the winter's grip and the frozen earth softened, Alara took her shovel and her husband's notebook and walked to the hill. She spent a week marking out the dimensions, not of a square, but of a long rectangle, its longest side facing due south. When Jedediah and his small crew came by on their way to the flatlands, they stopped, curious. He watched her for a moment, his brow furrowed in confusion. "What are you doing, Alara?" he asked, his tone not unkind, but laced with the authority of a man who knows his trade. "This is no place for a foundation. The ground is too soft here, and the grade is all wrong." Alara straightened her back, leaning on her shovel. She felt the eyes of the other men on her. "I am not building on the ground, Jedediah," she said, her voice steady. "I am building into it." She pointed with her chin toward the slope. "The back wall will be here, deep in the earth. The house will be sheltered." Jedediah stared at her, then at the shallow trench she had dug, then back at her. A slow smile spread across his face, a smile of genuine, uncomprehending amusement. The other men chuckled, looking at their feet. "Into the ground?" Jedediah echoed. You mean to build a root cellar and live in it? Woman, you'll be buried alive in the spring melt, or frozen solid in a tomb of your own making. The earth is cold. It leaches the warmth from a house. That's why we build on stone footings, to keep the logs off the damp ground. The surface is cold, Elara corrected him gently, echoing Martin's words. But deep down the earth holds a steady temperature. It will be a shield against the wind. The men's chuckles turned into open laughter. One of them, a young man named Silas, slapped his thigh. A dirt house, the widow's folly, he guffawed. Jedediah held up a hand, though the smile never left his face. Now, Silas, be charitable. Elara, I mean you no disrespect. You are a grieving woman, and your mind is troubled. This is not the way. Let us build you a proper cabin on the flat, next to the others. A smaller one, easy to heat. We will even help you with the logs. It was a kind offer, but it was steeped in condescension. He saw her as a weak, confused widow to be pitied and managed. He did not see the fierce resolve in her eyes, born of a mother's protective instinct. "Thank you, Jedediah," she said, her voice betraying no emotion. "But my mind is clear. This is my husband's design. I will see it through." Jedediah shook his head, a gesture of both pity and finality. "As you wish," he said, turning to his men. "But do not come to us when your walls collapse, or your fire won't draw. We are building real houses for folk who mean to see another spring." They walked away, their laughter and dismissive comments drifting back to her on the breeze. The name stuck. From that day on, her project was known throughout the settlement as the Widow's Folly. The name was spoken with a mixture of amusement and scorn, a cautionary tale in the making. Elara was now truly alone, her project not just a private endeavor, but a public spectacle. The work began. It was a grueling, solitary battle against the earth. The topsoil was soft, but a foot down, she hit a dense layer of clay and rock that fought her for every inch. Her shovel, a tool designed for garden soil, seemed to mock her. The blade would strike a stone with a jarring clang that shot up the handle and into her bones. She learned to use a pickaxe, a heavy, unwieldy tool that Martin had owned. The rhythm of the work took over her days, the swing, the thud, the scrape of the shovel. Her hands, soft from a winter spent indoors, blistered, then bled, then hardened into calluses. Her back and shoulders throbbed with a constant, deep ache. Each morning she would rise before the sun, tend to her children, and then walk to the hill. Thomas, old enough to understand her determination, if not her methods, would sometimes help, carrying away smaller stones in a bucket. Lily would play nearby, making small houses of her own from twigs and mud. The other settlers would pass on their way to the fields or the woods, and they would pause to watch the strange sight, a lone woman carving a hole in the side of a hill. They would shake their heads and walk on, their skepticism hardening into a settled conviction that she had lost her wits. While she toiled, the sounds of progress echoed from the flatlands. The rhythmic thud of Jedediah's crew felling trees, the sharp crack of axes splitting logs, the shouts of men hoisting beams into place. They were raising a new cabin, a large one for a new family, and they were doing it with practiced efficiency. Their work was visible, conventional, and fast. By the time Elara had finished excavating the 10-foot-deep, 30-foot-wide cavity for her home, they had already erected the 4 walls of the new cabin and were starting on the roof. Their progress was a constant public rebuke to her own slow, subterranean labor. They were building up into the light and air. She was digging down into darkness and dirt. But her work was not just digging, it was precise. Following Martin's diagrams, she ensured the floor sloped ever so slightly away from the back wall, towards a narrow drainage trench she filled with gravel. She spent weeks gathering flat, heavy stones from the creek bed, hauling them one by one on a crude sledge. These were for the back wall, the one that would hold back the earth. She did not know the art of masonry, but Martin's drawings were clear. She dry-stacked the stones, fitting them together like a puzzle, ensuring the wall was thick and solid, tilting back slightly into the hill to better bear its immense load. It was a slow, painstaking process. Each stone had to be lifted, tested, and placed. A single misplaced rock could compromise the integrity of the whole structure. For the front wall, the one facing south, she used traditional logs, but with a difference. She hewed them thicker than was common and laid them with a double wall, leaving a 6-inch gap between the inner and outer layers. The skeptical few who bothered to come close enough to inspect her work scoffed at the wastefulness. "Building 2 walls to heat?" one man sneered. "You'll use twice the wood for half the strength." Ilara said nothing. She just continued her work, patiently packing the gap between the walls with dried moss and dry grasses she had gathered. It was insulation, a concept so foreign to their building practices as to be nonsensical. Heat, to them, came from a fire. The idea that you could trap it within the walls themselves was a fool's notion. The roof was another point of ridicule. Instead of the steep, shingled pitch that Jedediah favored, her design called for a low-sloped roof with massive central beams. Once the heavy planking was laid, she covered it with thick layers of dried prairie grass, followed by the very sod she had excavated from the hole. She was putting the earth back on top of her house. To her neighbors, it looked like she was burying her own home before it was even finished. "She's planting a garden on her roof," Silas declared at the general store, to the amusement of all who heard. "Maybe she expects to harvest potatoes from her chimney." The final piece of the puzzle was the stove. Martin's design showed a small, efficient iron stove placed near the center of the single large room, but with a flue that was angled, running horizontally for several feet through a mass of stone and clay before turning upwards to exit through the roof. It was a masonry heater, a thermal mass stove. The idea was to heat the stone, which would then radiate a slow, even warmth long after the fire had died down. Jedediah, making a final, half-hearted visit to persuade her to abandon the project, saw the strange configuration and threw his hands up in despair. "That flue will never draw," he stated with absolute certainty. "It's angled. The smoke will fill the room and kill you in your sleep. Of all the foolishness, Ilara, this is the most dangerous." "It will draw," she said quietly. "The heat will create the draft. The stone will hold the heat." "It defies common sense," he said, his patience finally exhausted. He turned and left, and he did not come back. The community had rendered its final verdict. The widow's folly was not just foolish, it was a death trap. As autumn arrived, she moved her few belongings and her children into the strange, half-buried house. It was dark, with only the 2 small, deep-set windows on the south wall letting in light. It smelled of earth and damp stone. But as the first real cold snap of the season descended, she lit a small, cautious fire in the stove. The smoke hesitated for a moment. Then, just as Martin's diagrams had predicted, it caught the draft and flowed cleanly up the flue. The stone mass around the pipe grew slowly, wonderfully warm to the touch. The true test, however, was yet to come. The early winter was sharp, but manageable. Her life settled into a new rhythm, one of quiet endurance. Her woodpile, to her constant amazement, seemed to barely shrink. The small stove required only a few logs in the morning and a few in the evening to keep the stone mass warm. The interior of her home settled at a constant, comfortable temperature. It was never hot, but it was never cold. The earth that surrounded her on three sides was a vast, unmoving shield. The wind could howl and rage across the prairie, but inside, the silence was profound. The only sound was the crackle of the fire and the soft breathing of her children, who, for the first time in their lives, slept through the night without shivering. Then, in the second week of January, the sky changed. The crisp, cold blue vanished, replaced by a low, oppressive ceiling of bruised gray clouds that stretched from horizon to horizon. The air grew unnaturally still, and a strange, heavy silence fell over the plains. The experienced settlers knew the signs. It was the calm before the storm, the deep breath a predator takes before it strikes. A great blizzard was coming. It arrived not with a flurry, but with a wall of white. The world outside Ilara's small windows simply disappeared, erased by a churning, blinding torrent of snow. The wind, which had been holding its breath, exhaled with a single, sustained roar that did not cease for 3 days. It was a physical presence, a monstrous thing that screamed and clawed at the settlement. It hurled snow with such force that it felt like being sandblasted. The temperature plummeted to depths that no one had ever experienced, a cold so profound it felt as if the very air had become a solid, cutting substance. For the people in the log cabins on the flats, the world became a nightmare. The wind found every crack, every seam, every weakness in their homes. It forced fine, stinging snow through the chinking, which dusted the floors and furniture. The drafts were no longer like knives, but like broadswords, hacking away at whatever warmth the fires could produce. The cabins, which had seemed so solid, now felt like fragile, rattling cages. The timbers groaned under the assault, and the sound of the wind was a constant, terrifying shriek that frayed the nerves and made sleep impossible. They fought back with a desperate ferocity. They burned through their wood at a frantic pace, stuffing their stoves until they glowed red-hot. But the heat was immediately stolen by the cold. The rooms remained dangerously frigid. Families abandoned their separate rooms and huddled together in a single space, as close to the fire as they dared, wrapped in every blanket they owned. The windows were opaque sheets of ice. To touch the walls was to feel a cold that burned like fire. The woodpiles, which had to be accessed by tunneling through the rapidly deepening snow, were disappearing with terrifying speed. The siege had become a final, desperate battle for survival. Inside Jedediah's own home, the largest and supposedly best-built cabin in the settlement, the situation was grim. Despite a roaring fire, the temperature in the main room was barely above freezing. His wife, Martha, lay in bed, her breathing shallow, her body racked with a feverish chill. The wind hammered at the north wall of their cabin like a battering ram, and with every gust, the whole structure seemed to shudder. He had burned through a quarter of his remaining wood in a single day. He looked at his wife, at the fear in his children's eyes, and for the first time in his life, Jedediah felt the cold, hard touch of true despair. He had built this house with his own hands, with the trusted knowledge of his forefathers, and it was failing. He was failing. In the widow's folly, there was silence. The blizzard that was tearing the world apart outside was, to Ilara and her children, a distant rumor. The wind did not strike her house. It flowed over it. The low, sod-covered roof, now buried under a 6-foot blanket of insulating snow, held the structure in a silent, still embrace. The earth walls, their temperature a constant 40 degrees, radiated a gentle coolness that was easily overcome by the steady, radiant heat from the masonry stove. There were no drafts. There was no sound but the gentle hiss of the small fire. The air was calm and the warmth was even, a gentle presence that filled the entire space. Ilara used only a handful of logs every 12 hours. Her wood, stored in a small alcove carved from the earth next to her door, was plentiful. She baked bread. She mended clothes. She told stories to her children, who played on the floor, comfortable and safe. They were not besieged. They were sheltered. They were not fighting the storm. They were resting in the calm heart of it. The principles Martin had sketched in his notebook were not just theories. They were a living, breathing reality. The house was not a folly. It was a sanctuary. On the morning of the fourth day, the wind finally died. A brilliant, painful sunlight shone from a crystal-clear sky, illuminating a world transformed. The landscape was a sea of white, with massive drifts burying fences and outbuildings. The settlement on the flat looked like a collection of half-submerged wrecks after a flood. From each chimney, a frantic plume of smoke poured out, a sign of the desperate, ongoing battle for warmth. But from the hill, there was only a single, thin, lazy curl of smoke rising into the still air. Jedediah's wood was almost gone. Martha's fever had worsened. He knew he had to get help, but he also knew every house was in the same desperate state as his. Then he thought of Ilara. He thought of her strange, buried house, the one they had all laughed at. He imagined it collapsed under the snow, or filled with deadly smoke from its improper flue. A pang of guilt shot through him. In their pride, they had let her go her own way, perhaps to her death. Bundling himself in every layer he owned, he took a shovel and began the arduous task of digging his way out. The journey to her hill was a brutal struggle against the massive drifts. It took him nearly an hour to cover the few hundred yards. As he got closer, his heart sank. The house was gone. It had vanished, completely buried under a monstrous drift. All he could see was the top of the stone chimney, and from it, that impossibly calm, steady wisp of smoke. He fought his way to where he thought the door should be and began to dig frantically, his mind filled with terrible images. After several minutes of desperate shoveling, his shovel struck wood. He cleared the snow away and found the top of her door. He hammered on it with his fist. "Ilara, are you in there? Are you all right?" There was a muffled sound from within, and then the door scraped open a few inches, blocked by the snow he hadn't yet cleared. Ilara's face appeared in the gap. She was not pale or frightened. Her cheeks were rosy. She looked calm. "Jedediah, what is it? Is something wrong?" He was so stunned he couldn't speak for a moment. He had expected to find a tomb. Instead, he found a woman who looked as if she had just woken from a peaceful nap. As she pushed the door open further, a wave of air washed over him. It was not the scorching, dry heat of an overstoked fire, nor the damp chill of a cellar. It was a gentle, steady, and profound warmth. It was the air of a different season. Can I come in?" he stammered. She nodded, and he squeezed through the opening, stumbling into her home. The contrast was so stark, it was disorienting. Outside was a world of blinding white and lethal cold. Inside was a calm, dimly lit space filled with an almost magical warmth. The air was still. Thomas and Lily were sitting on a rug on the floor, playing with wooden blocks, wearing simple wool sweaters, not bundled in coats and blankets. The small stove gave off a gentle heat, but the real warmth seemed to come from the very walls, from the air itself. He looked at his own hands, which were numb and white with cold, and then at the children's faces, which were flushed and healthy. He walked to the back wall, the one made of stone and earth, and placed a trembling hand against it. It was not cold. It was cool, but it felt alive, a solid barrier that had held the winter at bay. He looked at the insulated log wall, the deep-set windows, the sod roof visible through the ceiling beams. He saw it all, and, in an instant, the world as he knew it, the world of his father's knowledge and his own hard-won experience, was turned completely upside down. He had been wrong. utterly, arrogantly, and dangerously wrong. "How?" he finally whispered, looking at Alara. His voice was filled with a raw, desperate awe. She did not gloat. There was no hint of triumph in her eyes, only a quiet, compassionate understanding. "The earth," she said simply. "It holds the warmth. The wind can't take it." She ladled some hot broth from a pot on the stove into a mug and handed it to him. "My husband was an engineer. He understood these things." Jedediah drank the broth, the warmth spreading through his chest, but it was nothing compared to the warmth of the realization that was dawning in his mind. He had built houses to fight the winter. Alara had built a house that made peace with it. He had used force. She had used wisdom. His creations were monuments to pride, standing tall and exposed on the open plain. Hers was a testament to humility, nestled into the sheltering embrace of the land. Word of Jedediah's visit spread through the snowbound settlement like a slow-burning fuse. At first it was met with disbelief, but as the day wore on and the cold in their own cabins became more and more unbearable, others began to make the difficult trek to the widow's folly. They came one by one, or in family groups, their faces etched with desperation and curiosity. Each one had the same reaction. They would dig their way to the door, expecting the worst, and be met with that same impossible wave of gentle, life-giving warmth. They would step inside and fall silent, their eyes wide with wonder. They saw the healthy children, the tiny woodpile, the calm, quiet atmosphere. They touched the walls. They felt the air. The laughter and mockery of the past months died in their throats, replaced by a profound and humbling respect. The place they had ridiculed as a folly was the only truly functional, truly safe home in the entire settlement. It was not a house, it was a revelation. The next morning, Jedediah returned. He was not the same man who had laughed at her plans. His arrogance was gone, stripped away by the brutal honesty of the storm. In his hand, he held a pencil and a small, leather-bound notebook. His wife, he explained, was safe, having spent the night with another family whose cabin had fared slightly better. He stood before Alara, his head bowed. "Teach me," he said. The words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a complete surrender. It was the apology he could not otherwise speak, and the highest compliment he could pay. It was the admission that his lifetime of knowledge was worthless in the face of her quiet, radical wisdom. Alara simply nodded. She did not ask for payment or praise. She did not remind him of his mockery. She took him through the house, explaining every detail with a patient clarity. She showed him Martin's notebook, pointing to the diagrams. She explained the principle of thermal mass, how the stone and earth absorbed and radiated heat. She explained the importance of the southern exposure for passive solar gain, how even the winter sun, streaming through the small windows, helped to warm the space. She explained how the sod roof was not a garden, but a heavy blanket of insulation. She shared her knowledge as a free and simple gift. Jedediah listened, his pencil scratching furiously in his notebook. He asked questions, no longer the dismissive queries of a skeptic, but the earnest, probing questions of a dedicated student. Other men from the settlement joined him, standing in the warm, quiet house, listening intently. The shame of their earlier mockery was a palpable presence in the room. But Alara's grace and generosity dispelled it. She was not a victor enjoying her spoils. She was a teacher sharing a vital lesson. That spring, a new sound filled the Dakota air. It was not the sound of axes ringing against trees, but the rhythmic scrape and thud of shovels digging into the earth. Led by a newly humbled and fiercely dedicated Jedediah, the men of the settlement began to build again. But this time, they did not build on the exposed flats. They turned to the rolling hills and gentle slopes. They built not just one, but a dozen new homes, all based on Ilara's design. The landscape of the community began to change. The tall, proud cabins were replaced by low-profile, earth-sheltered homes that seemed to grow organically from the land itself. The widow's folly became the template, the standard by which all new construction was measured. The knowledge spread. Travelers passing through would see the strange, sod-roofed houses and inquire about them. They would leave with sketches and notes, carrying the story of the quiet widow and her revolutionary design to other settlements, other territories. The idea, born of one man's engineering knowledge and one woman's desperate courage, began to propagate across the plains, a quiet, grassroots movement of practical wisdom. It was a legacy built not of stone and wood, but of an idea that worked. Years later, when the settlement had grown into a proper town, with a church and a school nestled amongst the low, warm homes, visitors would often ask about their unique style of architecture. The old-timers would smile and point to a small, unassuming house still nestled in its original hill. They would tell the story of the great blizzard of '87, and of the woman who had listened to the earth instead of to the loud voices of men. The lesson of that winter had been etched into the very foundations of their community. They had learned that true strength was not found in defiance of nature, but in partnership with it. And they learned that true wisdom often speaks in the quietest voice, arriving not to boast, but simply to offer a better way to survive the cold.